Revelation 12. Now, I know we come from different traditions and from churches with different liturgies, but in huge swaths of the church, after Scripture is read, it is common to say, "This is the word of the Lord." And the entire congregation responds, "Thanks be to God." That's a piece of liturgy we should not lose. So at the end I will say, "This is the word of the Lord," and you will say, "Thanks be to God." Let it be so. A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman, clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them, but woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short." When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening up its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. This is the word of the Lord. One day, when my son was about 3, I asked him where he obtained his huge, wonderful, deep blue eyes. He answered, "From God." And of course he was right. Mind you, he might have answered, had he been a biology student and about 20 years older, "I have my blue eyes because both you and Mom, though neither of you has blue eyes, must carry the necessary recessive genes, which happily supported each other in the formation of my DNA." Which description of reality is truer? They're equally true. Which is more fundamental? Another question. What caused the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah in 587-586 BC? Well, we could mention the rise of the Babylonian regional superpower, the decline and decay of the Davidic dynasty, the tragic pride of Hezekiah, the criminal stupidity of Zedekiah despite Jeremiah's warnings, the sins of the people, sins that attracted God's judgment. Or we could simply say, God did it. Which is truer? They're equally true. Which is more fundamental? What made Job suffer? Well, we could mention the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans and their bands of marauding riffs who came in and took all of his cattle and his sheep. We could mention the natural elements, the storm that took down his house and killed the 10 children that he had while they were having a party. We could mention the bereavement that he suffered. We could mention his loss of health. We could mention the torment of his friends. Or we could up the ante and say Satan. But if you read the first 2 chapters, you could also say God. Which description is truer? They're equally true. Which is more fundamental? So, a final question. What causes the church today her greatest difficulties and sufferings? Her greatest challenges? Well, I'm sure that the answers you might want to give would vary somewhat with your location. If you're in the southern Sudan, for example, which has lost something like 2 million people to violence and persecution in the last 3 decades, then you are inevitably going to talk about the marauding attacks from the northern government, the hatred that is held against them both on tribal and religious grounds. In some parts of the world, parts of Central Africa, you might mention tribalism, lack of trained leadership, pressures from AIDS. South of the Sahel, you might speak of drought. In the West, you might mention material prosperity, the rapid pace of life, the impact of mass media, rising secularization, pluralism, moral indifferentism, prayerlessness, and much more. But have you noticed that most of these categories are sociological, historical, occasional, demographic, psychological, all of them performance-related, nothing about the devil, and nothing about God. Do not misunderstand me. I kept saying in each of these descriptions, both the descriptions were true. But which one is more fundamental? I am certainly not saying that there is nothing to be learned from, say, sociological analysis. There is much to learn by reading, say, Peter Berger. But if all of our analyses are cast in such terms, not only are we too superficial, but we will be tempted to provide answers that are in the same scale, on the same dimension. We have sociological answers and sociological explanations, sociological resolutions. And suddenly we have become practicing atheists. That is to say, our analyses and our solutions are devoid of any unambiguous reference to God or to Satan or to the cosmic struggle that the Bible insists we are in. Now, if I understand the passage before us aright, God here gives us a deeper analysis of the difficulties and sufferings of the church. Chapters 12 through 14 mark a major division in the apocalypse. Before the final display of God's wrath, seen in the 7 plagues of chapter 16, John traces in these chapters the underlying cause for the hostility and suffering that fall upon the church. And it is nothing less than the rage of Satan. So you see, if we're going to address something like, what is the mission of the church? What is a gospel-shaped mission? Then part of our answer will depend on how big the challenge is that we envisage. I thoroughly recommend the little book by Gilbert and DeYoung, What is the Mission of the Church? And if those are the kinds of helps you need, by all means read that book. But supposing you see that the issue at the moment is not, how do you define evangelism? What is the Great Commission? How does that relate to the gospel? But supposing you widen the lens and say, what is the nature, in the final analysis, of the struggle in which we find ourselves? After all, does not Paul say we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers and principalities and powers of darkness in the heavenly places? Now, what's the mission of the church? So what I want to do this afternoon is rapidly run through chapter 12, just so that you see how it's put together, to come to this powerful attestation of the mission of the church in verse 11. 3 steps. Number 1, John outlines the occasion for this satanic rage, verses 1 to 9. He outlines the occasion for this satanic rage. In John's vision, the scene opens with a great and wondrous sign, we're told, which appeared in the heavens. Sign, here, as sometimes elsewhere in the book of Revelation, is a great spectacle that points in some way toward the consummation. It is a spectacle that is significant. That's how it's a sign. It's significant. The content of this spectacle is a woman, and what a woman she is. Clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She is not Mary. Although she gives birth to the one who is to rule with a rod of iron, which has prompted many people to think she is Mary, she can't possibly be Mary. Because down in verse 17, we're told that the dragon was enraged at the woman who went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. This woman is the messianic community. Whether under the old covenant, this messianic community which gives rise to Jesus, or the new. Just as Zion is seen in the Old Testament as the mother of the people of God, so also Messiah comes out of this messianic community. Hence, for example, in this Song of Zion in Isaiah 54, we read, "Sing, O barren woman, you who never bore a child. Burst into song, shout for joy, you who were never in labor." And clearly the reference is to Zion, to Jerusalem. Or again, in Galatians 4:26, by which time Jerusalem has already become a kind of figure. We read Galatians 4:26, "But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother." The messianic community, the heavenly Jerusalem, is our mother. Messiah comes out of this messianic community. She is clothed with the sun. That is, she is utterly radiant. And she has her feet on the moon, which is a symbol for dominion, with 12 stars on her head. Under the old covenant, that ties her to the 12 tribes. Under the new covenant, it ties her to the 12 apostles. We're told in verse 2, she is pregnant. She cries out in pain as she is about to give birth. The Jews sometimes spoke of the birth pains of the Messiah. These are not the birth pains that the Messiah has, as if the Messiah is a pregnant woman, but rather the birth pains that are necessary to bring forth the Messiah. These are based on such texts as Isaiah 26:17. "As a woman with child and about to give birth writhes and cries out in her pain, so were we in your presence, O Lord." In other words, it was anticipated that before the Messiah came, God's covenant community would go through very significant sufferings. What we have, in other words, in this symbolism, is true Israel in an agony of suffering and expectation as the Messiah comes to birth. Then there's another sign that appears, verse 3. A second sign in the pageant, in the spectacle. This time, an enormous red dragon. We read, then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Now, in case we have any doubt as to his identity, John identifies him for us down in verse 9. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent, which ties us to Genesis 3, called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Dragon, or Leviathan, or monster of the deep, these are standard symbols for all who oppose God. In the Old Testament, Leviathan, or the dragon, is associated with Egypt in Psalm 74, with Assyria and Babylon in Isaiah 27, with Pharaoh in Ezekiel 29. In fact, this sort of association can be made at the personal level. What is it that Jesus says to Peter when Peter gives Jesus some very bad theological counsel? Never, Lord, this shall not happen to you. No, you're mistaken on this point, Jesus. You're pretty good as Messiahs go, but when you start speaking of the death of the Messiah, it's really not on, you know. Jesus does not turn to him and say, my dear Peter, at this juncture you're making a mistake. Let me correct you. What he says is, get behind me, Satan. Now, do not misunderstand. The text is not saying that Satan somehow took over Peter so that Peter was demon-possessed and wasn't giving his opinion. Peter was giving his opinion. But it was a satanic opinion. And exactly the role of Satan in that satanic opinion is pretty hard to decipher, but Jesus would not have used words so serious if he did not detect behind Peter's stupidity and theological blindness the very counsel of Satan himself. So Satan, the dragon, can stand behind Egypt as Egypt oppresses the people of God, behind Assyria, behind Babylon, behind Pharaoh. He's a red dragon, probably symbolizing his murderousness intent. John elsewhere says in John 8:45, quoting the words of Jesus, that he was a murderer from the beginning. The 7 heads, that is the universality of his power. In apocalyptic literature, numbers are symbol-laden. In most of the rest of the Bible, it's much more disputable that they're symbol-laden. 7 suggests universality, the universality of his power and authority, like the 7 heads of Leviathan in Psalm 74. The 10 horns recall the 4th beast of Daniel 7 that Dr. Hugenberger mentioned a few moments ago. I wish I had time to unpack that one at length, but I'm going to skip it by here. Awesome power, kingly authority. The crowns, not here victory wreaths, but crowns of arrogated, of usurped authority against him who is described in this book as the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, 19:12. The one who will rule the nations with an iron scepter, we read in chapter 12, verse 5. They are arrogated signs of authority against him. Now, those are the 2 spectacles. And then the drama plays out in verses 4 to 6. Its tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. Now, this springs out of typical Hebrew nature poetry. When things are going well, then the hills dance for joy and the trees clap their hands. And when things are going abysmally, then 1/3 of the skies fall from heaven. It's not giving you details of astronomy, did you see? It is part of Hebrew nature metaphor that speaks how catastrophic this creature's activity really is. But it's the next line that is stunning. It's grotesque. It is meant to be shocking. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. So the covenant community, pictured as a woman, is described with this woman with her feet in the stirrups, pushing, about to give birth. And there is the devil himself, standing between the woman's legs, ready to grab the baby as it emerges and eat it. You're meant to be shocked at that. And the historical reality behind it? It's called the slaughter of the innocents, and it's described in Matthew 2. The historical reality behind it? The devil trying to ensure that Jesus would be pushed off a cliff. Ultimately, the historical reality takes Jesus to the cross. But at this juncture, the child is spared. We read verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. This in anticipation of Revelation 19. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. You say, whoa, wait a minute. You go from birth narrative to ascension? I mean, there are some things that happen between the two, you know. Why aren't they put in here? But there is a reason. The reason is because before you read Revelation 12, you're supposed to have read Revelation 1 to 11. And that includes Revelation 4 and 5. Revelation 4 and 5 is another large, coherent vision. You're supposed to have that tucked away in the back of your mind. Revelation 4 is to Revelation 5 what a setting is to a drama. Revelation 4, full of apocalyptic symbolism, describes the throne room of God, God in all of his majesty. And so many of the metaphors, of the symbols, point to God's spectacular, transcendental glory. He is the one who is so magnificent that even the highest order of angels cover their faces with their wings and cry, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty," picking up the language of Isaiah 6. They dare not look on him and live. And the song of heaven blesses God because he made all things and all things exist because of his will. That's just the setting. Chapter 4. Then in chapter 5, in the right hand of this God is a scroll sealed with 7 seals. It turns out that this scroll has in it all of God's purposes for judgment and blessing for the entire universe. That's what's in that scroll. And in the symbolism of the day, to effect what is in that scroll, that is, to bring to pass all of God's purposes for judgment and blessing, requires that someone slit the seals of the scroll, that the scroll be unfurled in order to bring about all of God's purposes. So an angel with a powerful voice offers the challenge to the entire universe. Who is able to approach this God, take the scroll, and open the seals? This God? Described in the setting chapter, the previous chapter, as someone so glorious that nobody can even look on him, not even the highest order of angels? You can't expect someone to saunter up and say, "I'll give it a try, God. Just give me the scroll." So the solemn sentence is pronounced. No one was found who was worthy. No angel, no human being, no necromancer, no one in the abodes of the dead. So John, the seer, he weeps and weeps. Not because he's a nosy Parker and his curiosity is frustrated, but because of the symbolism that says, in effect, this means that God's purposes will not be brought to pass. So the sufferings of the church are meaningless. Morality is lost. Things happen in this world. There's no significance or meaning or destination or goal or justification or vindication or righteousness or truth anywhere. It just happens. And he weeps. Until an interpreting elder touches him on the shoulder and says, in effect, "John, stop your crying. Look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has prevailed to open the scroll." So I looked, John says, and I saw a lamb. You're not supposed to think of two animals parked side by side, an animal and a lamb. One of the things that apocalyptic literature does is mix its metaphors. The lion is the lamb. And a stranger lamb you never saw. It's a slaughtered lamb, we're told. So it's a sacrificial lamb. But it's got 7 horns on its head. So it's got the perfection of all kingly authority. And it comes from the center of the throne. So he didn't have to come from the outside. He actually came from God himself. That's why when you go to Europe and you see in some European cathedrals, in the stained glass windows, you see pictures of a strange beast that's half lion and half lamb with a sword coming out of its mouth. You think, boy, have we got some confused literalists here. Because the point is, Jesus is not half lion and half lamb. He is the lion and he is the lamb. You do that with apocalyptic imagery, but you can't possibly draw it. How do you make a lion lamb? Half and half? 30-70? What do you do with that? That's why it's stuff that you have to preach, not draw pictures of. Now, he is able to open the scroll. And because he opens the scroll, he purchases men and women from God from every tongue and tribe and people and nation and brings all of God's purposes to pass. You see, all that's already established before you get here to chapter 12. When you get to chapter 12, that's all presupposed. John doesn't need to fill all that in again. So he goes from his birth and he goes immediately to his ascension to the Father's right hand. Because the focus here in this chapter is not on Christ. The focus on this chapter, in this chapter, is on the woman. In our terms, the focus in this chapter is on the church, on the covenant people of God, and the church's ongoing struggle with Satan himself. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. There are two bits of symbolism here that we should pick up. First, the desert, the wilderness. For anybody reading the Old Testament, the wilderness, the desert, was the place through which the people of God passed on their way to the promised land. But the desert, the wilderness, keeps cycling back in Old Testament prophecy. For example, in Hosea 2, verse 14, where the people of God are seen as it were, a prostitute running after other lovers and chasing away from God, anything to abandon God, the supreme husband. And God says, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. So the wilderness is simultaneously a place of testing, and it's a place where God is wooing and winning and attracting his bride. So this woman goes out into the wilderness, waiting, you see, for the promised consummation. What shall we make of 1,260 days? Well, an illustration I've sometimes used about the danger of numbers is this. You see, not all numbers in Scripture are symbol-laden, but in apocalyptic, they regularly are. Have you ever noticed that in John 21 there are 153 fish? I keep files on bizarre interpretations I have read. And I have quite a fat file on 153. Did you know that 1, and then in the next column 2, ... the next column 3 dots, ... next column 4, ... and you keep adding 1 dot, until you finally have an equilateral triangle of 17 dots on each side. You realize the total number of dots in that equilateral triangle is 153? Mathematically, this means that 153 is the triangular number of 17. And 17 is 7 plus 10. 10 is the number of the 10 Commandments. 7 is the number of perfection. And of course, it's made up of 3 plus 4. 3 is the number of the Trinity, and 4 is the number of the church built four square. 153 fish. You see, what it really means is, since we're supposed to be fishers of men, that in preaching the gospel and becoming fishers of men, eventually we preach the commands of God in the name of the Holy Trinity to the church of God built four square. I guarantee I could preach that in most of your churches with a straight face, and people would say, deep, deep. Now let me tell you the real reason why there are 153 fish. Because there was one more than 152 and one less than 154. And some character said, boy, that's a lot of fish. I wonder how many. And they counted them. But when you get to apocalyptic literature, the numbers really are symbol-laden. It's why this book is stuffed with 7 and 3 and 4 and 12 and 10 and so on. These numbers recur and recur and recur. Then you get multiples of 12 times 12 is 144. That's deeply symbol-laden. I don't have time to go through them all, but that's pretty standard. So what is 1,260? On an idealized month, with 30 days a month, which is the way a lot of Jewish calculations worked, 1,260 days is 42 months, which are also mentioned in this chapter, which is 3.5 years, also mentioned in these chapters. Calculated as time, 1 year, times 2 more years, and half a time. All 4 expressions, 1,160 days, time times and half a time, 3.5 years and 42 months, they all have the same significance in the book of Revelation. What's the significance? Well, you'll forgive me, I'm a Canadian. But when I came down here, I made a point of reading the Federalist Papers and the Constitution and making sure I knew my share of American history. And eventually I worked my way to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and so on. How does Lincoln's Gettysburg Address begin? 77 years. That is iconic in America. All I have to say is 77. If I said 87, nobody would have a clue what I was talking about. But if I say 70, everybody knows what I'm talking about, don't they? It's iconic. It becomes a symbol-laden thing that points not only to the Gettysburg Address, but to the gap before which the Civil War began to address the issue of slavery in the country. It's iconic, isn't it? Many, many, many cultures develop an iconic time period somewhere in their history because of something or other that has happened to them. For the Jews, it was 3.5 years. Because toward the beginning of the 2nd century before Christ, little Israel found itself squashed between the regional superpower down in Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the regional superpower up in Syria, up in the north. They were squashed back and forth, and eventually the Syrians won. And Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the king at the time, decided to crush Judaism. He marched in with his troops and sacrificed pigs in the temple. He made it a capital offense to observe the Sabbath. He made it a capital offense to be a priest. He made it a capital offense to possess any part of Torah. And as his troops were going through the land, killing people, slaughtering people, imposing paganism, they eventually came to a small hill town, a little village. And there they met an old man by the name of Mattathias, who was a priest. And somehow Mattathias killed the emissary who was sent. Mattathias had 3 sons. The first was called Judah, and he came to be called Judas the Hammer. In Aramaic, Judas Maccabeus. And he started a systematic guerrilla warfare. I'm told, I don't know if it's the case, maybe there's somebody who can tell me afterwards, but I'm told that still in some military colleges in this country, people have to read Josephus' account of that Maccabean revolt, since it's the first, earliest description of guerrilla warfare known to us in literature. Pages and pages of Josephus, a first-century historian, describe it. And they kept attacking and attacking and attacking and attacking. Mattathias died, Judas died, one of his brothers took over, and so on. But eventually, there was a set piece on the banks of the Orontes River, and the Jews won, and for the first time in such a long time, they owned their land again, and they cleansed the temple. That 3.5 years, in other words, became symbol-laden for them of a period of desperate suffering and struggle as they're waiting for God finally to release them again. And that's the way this is described here. We're told she has to be taken care of by God for a set piece of time, 1,260 days. The point is not that it's only 3.5 years. The point is it's this set period of time in God's own design. Verses 7 to 9 describe this struggle in Britain. I'm crossing too many time zones recently. This this struggle in heaven that finally casts Satan out. So we read in verse 10, after Satan has been thrown down to the earth, we read, "Then I heard a loud voice, 'Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down.'" Likewise in verse 12, "Rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea," that is our domain, "because the devil has gone down to you." So in the next chapter, the devil calls forth two helpers, one from the earth and one from the sea, two beasts. One who's a violent beast of persecuting force, and the other who's a deceptive beast, a false prophet. And the three of them constitute a kind of unholy triumvirate. In fact, when you read these chapters very carefully in the original, you see that John picks up some of the language that is used of the Trinity in John 14, 15, and 16. It's as if the devil is trying to constitute an alternative Trinity with himself and the two beasts against God himself. Do you see? That's the struggle that we're involved in these chapters. So, in other words, John outlines the occasion for this satanic rage, and the reason for it is precisely because Satan knows that he's defeated. He identifies now the reasons for this satanic rage. He outlines the occasion, he's defeated, and now the reasons for this satanic rage. Look at this rather quickly. Verses 10 and 12. Satan knows that his time is short. He is vituperative. He is nasty. The troubles of the persecuted righteous, of the church of the living God, of the deceptive powers wielded against them, arise not because Satan is so strong, but because he's beaten and he knows it. Toward the end of World War II, by which time the Russians were pushing in through Poland toward Germany, by which time the Western Allies had cleared out North Africa and were pushing up the boot of Italy. Eventually, in June 1944, the Western Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy, and in 3 days they dumped in 1.1 million men and countless tons of war materiel. And you know, anyone with half a brain in his head could see the war was over. In terms of energy supplies, metal, men, money to pay for it, renewable resources, it was over. So what happened? Did Hitler say, oops, and sue for peace? No, he was filled with fury and tried to break out again in what came to be called the Battle of the Bulge. And the only reason he didn't get all the way to the beaches of France and the Atlantic again was because he ran out of gas. And some of the bloodiest fighting in the entire war was in the siege on Berlin. In other words, the enemy we face now has been beaten decisively by Christ. Already during his ministry, as the disciples were preaching the good news, Jesus could say, I saw Satan fall from heaven. When Jesus dies on the cross, he silences forever the accusations of the accuser of the brothers. The accuser could say, God, I don't know how you go around still looking at yourself in the mirror and say that you're holy. I mean, how can you possibly say have you ever considered that Don Carson creep? Do you know? He's got so much sin, it's unbelievable. And you say you're holy? But Christ has paid for Don Carson's sin. The accuser of the brothers is silenced. He can't even do to us what he did to Job. He's beaten. But he's not yet chained. He's not yet been thrown into the lake of fire. And far from being softer because of it, he is filled with fury because he knows his time is short. Do you recall how Jesus sometimes confronts demons in his day? And they say, do not send us into the abyss before the time, which shows that they know their time is coming. They're defeated. They know it. And they're in bleak despair and full of fury. So Satan's time is short. Satan's sphere is limited. He's been cast out of heaven, and therefore he descends to the earth, finds his two beasts. And so we read, verse 13, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. That is, the covenant people of God. And what you get in the following description is lots of Exodus typology. The woman was given the two wings of a great eagle. That's language that God uses of Israel in Exodus 19. So that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness where she would be taken care of. For a time, times, and half a time. That is a stipulated period of tribulation that covers all the period from Christ's first coming to his second. Out of the serpent's reach. Then from the mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. Which reminds us again of the drowning of the people, possibly reflecting Exodus 1:22. And on and on and on. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep you away. Isaiah 43:2. These background texts are being picked up into this dynamic form here. So his sphere is restricted, his success is limited, but he is angry and he is taking us on. Often Christians have argued back and forth. Will the earth get better and better, or will it get worse and worse? Will the gospel so prevail that the earth will eventually get better and better? Or will it just get worse and worse and worse? And people quote things with proof text fervency. Evil men and seducers will wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. But in the context, that's not saying that every generation is worse than the preceding one. It's saying that in every generation, people get worse. Hitler didn't start off being Hitler. He started off as a baby. Everybody thought he was cute, I'm sure. But he got worse and worse. Do you see? That's what happens in every generation. So, will the world get better? Will the world get worse? Well, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. And as a friend of mine says, I work for a non-profit organization. But I'll tell you what's going to happen anyway. Jesus tells the parable of the wheat and weeds that I mentioned this morning. One of the reasons I mentioned it this morning, because I knew I was going to use it this afternoon. What Jesus says to the disciples who want to pluck out the weeds right away is, let both grow until the end. Do you hear that? Let both grow until the end. So let me tell you what will happen. Both will grow until the end. There will be revivals. There will be times of reformation. There will be vast numbers that will be swept into the kingdom. The gospel will prevail on all kinds of fronts. Countless millions will be converted. Also, there will be persecution and violence and hatred and genocide and malice against Christians, taking various forms, sometimes in deceptive doctrine, sometimes in outright persecution, and both will grow until the end. Do you realize that there have been more men and women converted to Christ in the last 150 years than the previous 1,800 combined? Don't clap too soon. There have been more martyrs in the last 150 years than the last 1,800 combined. And both will grow until the end. It won't surprise me in the slightest if some who are now in this room face physical persecution, as we face now the deceptiveness of the false prophet. So John identifies the reasons for the struggle in which we find ourselves. The woman and the children of the woman, those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. He identifies the problem. And the problem is, we're not just struggling against flesh and blood. We're not just confronting New England intellectualism. We're not just confronting a laissez-faire materialism. We're not confronting merely the new tolerance. We're not confronting merely biblical illiteracy and ignorance. No. Somewhere along the line, we have to face the fact that we face the devil himself. So now, what's the mission of the church? How do we prevail? Which brings me to my last point, which I can run through quickly. John specifies how Christians overcome Satan and his satanic rage. Verse 11. Satan, we're told in the previous verse, accuses our brothers and sisters day and night before God, even though he's been hurled down. But we read, number one, they triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb. literally on the ground of the blood of the Lamb. You see, I have no defense against Satan by saying, oh, come on, Satan, stop accusing me. I mean, I'm not as bad as you think. I'm a pretty nice guy, really. You know, my wife loves me. Probably my mother did when she was alive. Compared with some people, I'm not bad. Compared with the holiness of God, that gets me absolutely nowhere. But what I can say is, you're right, Satan. Entirely right. I plead the blood of Christ. That's my whole answer. Nothing more. I have no other argument. I need no other plea. It is enough that Jesus died and that he died for me. And that's how we constrain all the fiery darts of Satan, seeking to destroy us and ruin our confidence and our sufficiency in Christ. We go back to the cross again and again. An illustration I've sometimes used pictures two men, Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones, two Jews at the time of the Exodus with remarkable names. And you're the night before Passover. And Mr. Smith turns to Mr. Jones and he says, have you daubed your doorposts and lintel with the blood of a slaughtered lamb? Oh, yes, of course. Moses said we really had to do that. Well, so have I. He said, but to be frank, I'm really worried. What do you mean you're really worried? Well, Moses says that tonight the angel of destruction is going through the land. Don't you see? And the firstborn is going to be wiped out of animals and of children, of human beings, for every household where there isn't blood on the two doorposts and on the lintel. Mr. Jones says, well, you put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel. Well, yes, I know, but think of all the things that have gone on the last few weeks. I mean, flies, darkness, frogs, pretty disgusting things. And now we're having an angel of destruction go through the land. I'm really nervous. I'm not, says Mr. Smith. God says that if the destroying angel sees the door with blood on it, then he'll pass over. I'm expecting a party tonight. Well, says Mr. Smith, you've got 16 kids. I've only got my one son. I'm going to lose my whole family if I lose my Andy tonight. That night, the angel of destruction passed through the land. Which one lost his son, Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones? The answer, of course, is neither. Because the condition was not how strong your faith is, but the blood. So also for us today, brothers and sisters in Christ, the issue is not how strong your faith is. It's the blood of the Lamb. And that's how Christians overcome the devil. Second, they overcome him by the word of their testimony. Verse 11b. This does not mean that they give their testimonies a lot. I mean, they may, but it's not the point here. It means they bear testimony to Jesus. In other words, they talk about the gospel. How do you advance the cause of Christ in a broken, damned world where the devil is filled with fury? Well, you yourself take your stand on the blood of Christ. But in addition, what you do is you bear testimony to Jesus. You talk about his death, his resurrection. You talk about his reign. You talk about his return. You talk about his righteousness. You talk about his sovereignty. You talk about Jesus. You bear witness to Jesus. In other words, you gossip the gospel. What shall we do to push back the powers of darkness? Retreat to a little holy huddle and say, these are dark times, Well, they are dark times, especially in some parts of the country. But what you do is you gossip the gospel, and that's what you do. What else are you going to do? Send in the Marines? We tried that once. It's called the Crusades. You don't advance the kingdom that way, don't you see? There may be a place for military strength for governments, but that's not the way the church advances. That's not the way the gospel advances. That's not the way the gospel of the cross advances. That's not the way you beat Satan. No. There's a third way you beat Satan. By simple willingness to die. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. I love to reflect on that passage in Acts chapter 5, verse 41, where the disciples, the apostles, face the first whiff of persecution. They're beaten up. And the text says they rejoiced because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. It's taken me a while to figure out what's going on in their heads. Don't forget the night before Jesus goes to the cross, Jesus had solemnly told them, according to John chapter 15 and 16, he had solemnly told them that a slave is not above his master. If they persecuted me, Jesus said, they're going to persecute you. If they loved me, they'll love you. And you really have to expect something of the same kind of treatment that I got. And then Pentecost happens. Thousands are converted. Their reputation in Jerusalem is spectacular. Oh, the authorities don't like them very much, but the authorities are cowed. Meanwhile, the crowds think they're wonderful. They struggle for a place on the sidewalk to get Peter's shadow to pass over them. People are getting converted. A few weeks later, 5,000 men, plus all the women and children converted. A church of what, 20,000 in Jerusalem? Unbelievable. And you can imagine one of the apostles turning to another and saying, you know, this is fun. It's spectacular. The times of promise are with us. But I wonder what Jesus meant about the persecution. You know, I mean, I'm glad it's not here and all that. But you remember what Jesus said on the night that he was betrayed? Where's the person? Are we doing something wrong? You know? How come so many people like us? Nobody's even got beaten up. You know, not a single jail sentence, not a martyr in sight. And then the apostles get beaten up. And they say, yes, it's about time. And they rejoice because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. Now suppose, brothers and sisters in Christ, all throughout New England, every time you are belittled or mocked, every time you're told that you're a nitwit because you believe all those silly, bigoted superstitions, every time you fall under what Jesus describes, blessed are you when men revile you, persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you for my sake and the gospel's. If every time you said to yourself, yes, what a privilege to suffer for Jesus, bring it on, I guarantee that would change the witness in New England. Because instead of being inward and frightened and concerned, do you see, it would be effervescent and irreplaceable and irrepressible and powerful all the time. Oh, you'd get all kinds of people really ticked. And you yourself would be rejoicing because you were counted worthy to suffer for the name. And that's how you beat the devil. Hiding under the cross. Bearing witness to Jesus. And you do not shrink from death of any sort. And that's how you have a gospel-shaped mission in the Church of Jesus Christ. I tell you, there are two applications of overwhelming importance. Number one, we must analyze our situation biblically and theologically, not simply sociologically and psychologically, but biblically and theologically. And then we will be able to say, with Luther, who understood this, and though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word will fell him. And the next stanza shows that that word is the gospel word. And second, we must recognize and use our weapons, the only effective weapons we have, all that are based on Christ's atoning death, including the gift of the Spirit, the assurance of sins forgiven, all the authority based on proclaiming the word of the cross, the word of the gospel, bearing testimony to Jesus, all the courage of integrity that emerge emerges because death cannot frighten those who follow the Prince of Life. I told the folk I cherished how my sins had been forgiven, how Jesus changed my outlook, took my guilt, and gave me heaven. They thought I'd lost my senses, turned fanatic, lost my reason. They charged me with betrayal, with a vicious kind of treason, and I wondered why salvation should cause me so much pain. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you, for the slave is not above the Lord he serves. My assignment was the cross. You, my slave, will bear some loss. My disciple takes his cross and daily nerves his heart and mind to follow me. Then soon I learned my brothers and my sisters in the Savior so often shine in suffering with astonishing behavior, adorn the blessed gospel with forbearing perseverance, forgive their cruel tormentors with a graceful, firm endurance. Still, I wondered why salvation should cause them so much pain. What alien perspectives I pursued with willful blindness. For apostolic servants would rejoice at God's great kindness in reckoning them worthy to take on a little battering. They longed to know Christ's power and the fellowship of suffering. For they understood their calling to trust and suffer pain. To you it has been granted on behalf of Christ not only to believe in his name, but to suffer for his sake. Philippians 1:29. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. For the slave is not above the Lord he serves. My assignment was the cross. You, my slave, will bear some loss. My disciple takes his cross and daily nerves his heart and mind to follow me. Let us pray.